R.A. Busby, welcome to This Is Horror.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on with you and with Bob and to be talking about a subject that I love with two really well-informed folks. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're really excited to do this. And I mean, already off air, we've seen that there's so much that we can talk about because we've taken about half an hour before we've actually hit record. But we decided that as we got together to record a podcast, we should probably do the recording part.
Mhm.
It helps.
But as with a lot of these conversations, I want to know what some early life lessons were that you had growing up.
Boy, it's sort of like where do you begin exactly? Um, I don't. Are you talking about just in personal experience, or with reading, or horror, or all of the above, or?
I like to run the whole gamut, so we can even start with a personal experience and jump into something writing or horror specific.
Oh boy. I'd say in terms of pushing me to horror as a genre, some of my earliest memories of like the things I read that were horrifying were um, I read a lot of fairy tales, especially Hans Christian Andersen, which is really messed up, man.
Yeah.
And and of course, the Grimm brothers and pretty much anything else that I could get my hands on. Poe, um, uh, Macbeth, pretty. I really loved the genre pretty much from the jump.
Yeah, and in terms of those stories, I mean, I'm wondering how did you discover your first dark fairy tale? I'm wondering, was it a case of somebody reading it to you? Was it an adventure in the library? What happened there?
I'd say it was my mom giving me a book because it was the one thing that was reliable for me to like stop talking and like leave her alone and give her some time. And so she was more than happy to hand me, pretty much anything. And so I remember really vividly being a kid and reading pretty much anything that I could get my hands on. I was yeah, I and found myself both scared and responsive to books like Madeline L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time, or every single Oz book ever made, um, because some of those moments are pretty scary. Uh, but I think I like them because yeah, I think even as a child I understood that they're telling a kind of raw truth, um, and one that I think that children understand, even though they might not understand all the permutations of it. It's like, yeah, finally somebody is admitting the truth, which is that no, the world isn't all smiles and sunshine, and the forest does have monsters in it. So watch out.
Do you think that reading some of these tales made you realize that there were more dangers in the world than perhaps you'd been told? And do you
Oh,
think in in a sense that horror can help us grow up quicker?
I don't know about whether it helps us grow up quicker, but it might help us grow up a little wiser. Um, I I was just thinking about how when I was a little kid, I grew up in the Southwest desert, and whenever I would and it was the era of parenting where you pretty much let your kids just wander wherever, and so when we had the desert backing up to our home, and so there's basically nothing but a lot of desert in between um, my parents' house and the mountains. Um, and so my mom would just basically say, watch out for snakes, as being the big advice. And I think in many ways, the fairy tales were like, yeah, here's why you should watch out for snakes. Because if you go into the forest, you're going to encounter the cannibal witch. Uh, if you step on that loaf of bread, you'll be sucked down into hell. Or, or, be, or if you see a woman in white, um, if you see a woman in white calling your name by the river, run the other way because that's just not a good thing. So yeah, I think a lot of those were sort of helped form the texture of my world as a kid growing up. How about you all?
Well, hang on a minute because we're not done with this, and we're not done with the desert. You can't pass the baton to us so easily. So I want to know. I mean, when you were exploring the desert, did you encounter any snakes? Did you encounter any danger when you're off there, kind of, exploring the wild on your own as a kid?
Oh, absolutely. And if you're a kid, it's all dangerous because this, was well before the era of cell phones, and so I would usually just follow the arroyos because it was a pretty solid landmark. Like if you follow the arroyo up, you can follow the arroyo back. But yeah, I pretty much saw. Uh, I did in fact watch out for snakes.
Mm,
And only later did I encounter one when I was more of an adult. But Gila monsters, lizards of all kinds, and your usual wildlife. But the big danger, obviously, is dehydration. So that's why you
yeah.
definitely don't want to get lost out there.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm imagining too, living in the desert, you had to take certain precautions in terms of like protecting your skin and also, as you say, like bringing a lot of water with you so that, yeah, you
Neither of
don't
which I
suffer.
did. So
Yeah.
no, but I did
Well,
watch out for the snakes. So
yeah, yeah, and to give us a sense, I mean, what age are we talking when you're going out and exploring?
oh, probably 6, 7. Um, and way way early. I mean, old enough to be watchful, old enough to follow the arroyo instead of wandering off. Sort of going off book, as it were. But not exactly. Oh, I don't know, not exactly Survivor Man out there. So
Yeah, yeah. Did you combine your love of walking in the desert and reading? Did you bring a book, and you'd settle somewhere?
there's actually a picture of me when I was camping with my parents, and I'm sitting there in a mountain stream reading, and the thing is, I remember exactly what I was reading too. It was C.S. Lewis's *The Voyage of the Dawn Treader*.
Oh,
Um, so yeah, I pretty much had a book wherever I went, so it wouldn't surprise me at all.
yeah,
Yeah, no
yeah,
sunscreen, but definitely C.S. Lewis. So
yeah. Well, I mean, if the sun gets really brutal, then you can just put like the Chronicles of Narnia over your head for a bit.
Aslan, protect me from sunburn.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, you touched on this previously, and I know that you've spoken about it in other interviews too, but this idea that, horror is the genre where you can be honest. It is a vehicle for truth. And so, I mean, this is a fascinating area to explore. So I'm wondering rather broadly, what do you think it is about horror that allows us to tell the truth and to be honest in a way that is harder with other genres?
I think because we can let our monsters be monsters. And I think because we can let the darkness be the darkness, and we can let the darkness both be within us and without us. And we can have monsters that look like people and people that look like monsters. And that's a truth that most of us in real life, I think, have to figure out. If you have, swiped on Tinder and you've said, yeah, let's go on a date with this person. Are they a monster? Do they look like one? I don't know. And just in interactions with people in the everyday, it's difficult to tell. But in a horror movie, um, one of the things I love about both horror fiction and horror film is that your instincts are right. you shouldn't, you shouldn't pick up that phone. Yes, you have been impregnated by the devil if you're in Rosemary's Baby, or your kid is possessed by Satan if it's The Exorcist. And there's an overwhelming sense, I think, in a lot of horror fiction, that your fears are not a sign of weakness; they are a source of strength, and you should pay attention to them. And I think that that's a message that, especially for everybody, certainly, but for women too, gets pushed down as being, oh, you're overreacting, or you're being emotional, and your fear is here to tell you, or are you? So I think that that's a validation that horror fiction can provide all of us.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're absolutely right that unfortunately, most things that we do in everyday life, particularly when there are unknown variables like going on a Tinder date, it could go very wrong. So we have to really trust our kind of intuition and hope that it leads us to the right place. But yeah, sometimes it doesn't. That's
No,
yeah,
and I love that
there's
scene
no
in
good way
Psycho.
of putting that really.
No, but I was going to say I love that scene in Psycho where Marion Crane realizes that this nice young man that she sat down to have, sort of an impromptu casual dinner with, is has some deep problems, and she's really trying to thread the social needle very carefully, keeping herself safe, keeping the situation from turning dangerous, and the delicacy of that moment. Um, I think strikes a chord in almost anybody who has been, in a similar situation.
I think that Psycho is very authentic, and I think that a problem with quite a number of particularly films and TV shows is that a character will find out like, "Uh-oh, I'm with a sociopath," but then they will completely I was gonna say overreact. It's like, no, you should be panicking. Definitely, this is not a good thing. But they will make it so visible
Mm,
and
mm.
obvious, and they'll be like, right, I gotta go, and it's. I always get frustrated at the television set when that's going on. It's like, no, the moment you realize, because often they've had some sort of relationship or correspondence for a relatively long time. So it's like, just keep cool,
Mm,
just
mhm.
act normally. They haven't done anything to you in the last 2 weeks. You can get through this if you just play it as if you didn't have that knowledge.
Mhm,
You've
mhm.
just got to keep calm and get out of the situation. But, in 90% of these films and these TV shows, they don't. They make it so obvious, and then there's trouble.
I really just think there's a fascinating and interesting tension that happens in either movies or and I think that Stephen King did this really well in Misery, early in the game, where he's realizing that Annie is a little bit more than just his number one fan, and he's got more to worry about than just his legs, and he's trying to balance that delicate interaction where let's all keep on the masks, let's everybody, play through this, and put on the nice face, and panic on the inside. Uh, and pretty soon, obviously, the masks come off, of course, it's a Stephen King novel. But that balance, that keeping things moving so that everybody seems happy, is just really super tense as a scene. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess, like, I jump to more extreme examples, like there being a sociopathic serial killer, which I suppose is an oxymoron. It's not like a serial killer that's not a sociopath. But we can have more micro examples of this. Like, you might get into a relationship with someone and you just realize that they're not a good person,
mm,
but it's going to be less. hassle for your life long term if you kind of ease out of the relationship rather than break it off, quickly just because of the nature of that person. So there's all sorts of times where we have to get out of a dangerous or a difficult situation. And I mean, being a human is unfair because you should be able to say, I just want to get out of this now and I'm done. But so often you can't do it like that. It's not that simple.
And to get back to one of your earlier points or earlier questions, that I think that in many ways horror fiction says, okay, this is the worst that can happen. Uh,
Mm,
you want uh, you want it dark? Here it is, and
yeah,
here's how either things can go terribly wrong. Um, but for the most part, I find it overall a hopeful genre because a lot of times the main character finds that way out. They find a way to thread the needle. They find a way to take advantage of an unexpected situation. And so, oddly enough, I think it, in many ways, it's a helpful roadmap
yeah,
for horror readers. Yeah, this is the worst that can happen, and here's how you get out
yeah. Yeah, and I find that there's always a kind of dichotomy in ending a story too. It's like, right, how much hope
of it.
do we leave the reader with? It's like, are we going full Eric LaRocca? And it's like, there ain't no hope. This is darkness. This is life. Or do we go Dean Koontz and there is ultimately a happy resolution. And yeah, from each story, you've got that dichotomy. And I think often we fall somewhere in the middle of the classic LaRocca to Koontz scale that everyone should be familiar with. And I hope
And
will now be popularized as a measuring scale
on a
going
scale of
forward.
LaRocca to Koontz, where do you
Yeah,
fall?
yeah, yeah,
I fall at the
exactly.
R.L. Stein,
Yeah,
in the middle.
yeah.
Oh, that's a great. That's a. I like that scale quite a lot. That's really good.
Yeah, yeah. It
So where
it
do you?
is
I was going to say, where do you fall on the LaRocca to Koontz zone? Either you or Bob or both.
well, I think that I often fall nearer the LaRocca end of the scale. However, it is something that I'm becoming conscious of that I don't want to always fall on the same place as the scale
Mm,
because I don't want it to get to a point where people know how this is going to end. So, I mean, if I look at the three books that I've done so far, The Girl in the Video They're Watching and House of Bad Memories, they all fall in a slightly different place on the scale. And I mean that there was one of those books where I felt I need to give a little bit more hope because I want there to be a message of positivity at the end. But I never go full Dean Koontz. I probably go close sometimes to going full LaRocca. So yeah, goodness, where would I fit? Who is the analogy? Yeah, maybe I fall near Jack Ketchum on that classic scale.
okay, okay. Well, and Ketchum obviously has some really tough stuff.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Bob, where do you fall?
Well, I mean, using their watching as an example, that's definitely the LaRocca ending. But I mean, I think we both kind of insisted that it was going to end that way in a brutal sense, uh, because it's a really cool reveal. Let's just say that. And so, but with Mojo Rising, it's more of an ambiguous, because we have somebody who has done, he has satisfied the quest that he was on. Um, those quests do not end up with super happy endings, but he has a way to make them or allow the survivors to have some kind of ending. But if knowing what you know about the drug that he's affected on and what he does with the remaining drug at the
mm,
end gives you a really ambiguous ending, which I like. It's like, hey, this is where we're gonna part ways on the story. And and I've often thought about, hey, what if I write a sequel? What's going to happen? And I was like, well, uh, to me, the total inevitable thing is that the main character from Mojo Rising would not be in a sequel,
Mm.
but he would be mentioned later as that crazy guy out in the marsh. So, but yeah, but that could kind of give you an idea of what of what happened. But I like the ambiguous ending. So that one kind of fell right there in the middle because good things happen and bad things could possibly happen. But like the one I'm working on now is full blown Eric LaRocca. I mean, it's like the last page of my minuscule notes I've written is basically no one lives. So I
Spoiler.
mean, and it's in all caps about this tall on a page this big, and it's just basically no one lives, and uh, that's that's about as bleak as I can get it. How we're gonna get there and what happens and why no one lives is the story, and I think those that ending will hopefully be earned. And that's to me that's the most important thing. Did I earn the ending, or do the characters earn the ending?
Fair enough.
That's
Fair
something
enough.
that's been beaten into my head uh since reading reading Dean Koontz's out of print book about how to write. So yeah, you want to earn
I
your
didn't know
ending.
that he wrote a book on how to write. That's interesting.
Yeah, he did. But I think it's sadly out of print. I think you might be able to find some online for like pretty high prices, but
Mm.
it was a good book. He wrote it in like the I want to say early '80s, and God, I wish I had it, but I checked it out from the library, and I don't steal, so oh well. Then maybe they still have it. I might need to go check. Hmm. Hmm. Got a task.
Well, it's I think that issue of earning the ending and is a crucial one. I'm glad to know, by the way, that somebody else writes themselves notes in on their manuscript in big, huge letters,
Mhm.
like "This has got to happen," or "Start here," or "You have to mention this." So it's interesting to hear about some other folks' process too. So, do you
What
also?
a
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, what about you, RA? Where do you see yourself in terms of on the scale of Koontz to LaRocca or LaRocca to Koontz,
Oh,
depending if we're talking American or British English? And I mean, are you conscious of how bleak or hopeful you're going to make an ending during the writing process, or is that not a concern?
I'd say I have. I almost always have the ending in mind before I start because if I don't, um, I get off track, and it's sort of the um, it's sort of the equivalent of packing to go to Birmingham, England, and ending up in Birmingham, Alabama. It's those are two different places,
Yeah,
and so I've at least got to have that sketchy idea in mind. But in terms of where on the Kunst de la Rocca scale, I'd say I wobble. I say I wobble, and some of that has to do with that with what Bob was saying about the earned ending. Is that where are does the situation admit of somebody getting out of this? And if not, then darn it, commit to that. Everybody dies here. Ending to yourself. So it's partly the situation, partly the characters. But I at least want in those works that I've written where it doesn't end well, I at least want somebody to feel like, yeah, that's what should have happened.
yeah. Yeah, I think too, like sometimes I'll add some light or I'll add some hope because not only do I think the readers need it, but I need it. And
Right.
I'm just gonna be a mess if I don't add that glimmer of hope.
Right.
And sometimes I mean, I try to create the world that I would want to live in. Now,
Mm.
some people haven't read my fiction will be like, What the hell world do you want to live in?" But, you know, I'm talking more broadly about a world where there is hope rather than just being consumed by absolute darkness, you know?
Well, and in many ways, I think we live in both of those worlds where it is kind of consumed by absolute darkness, and there is hope. I mean, I'm just sort of mindful of that. The ending of Cormac McCarthy's *The Road*, which for me is one of the most horrifying horror novels that wasn't intended to be a horror novel that I've ever read, and it's bleak with a capital B.
Mm,
Um, and at the end, there is a tiny, tiny glimmer of hope, and you realize that in the larger context of that work, it's a spark that's probably going to give out
mm,
past the ending of the novel, but at least for the time being, it does exist, and that in some ways that's enough. At least it was for me.
yeah, yeah.
If you haven't read
Mhm.
it, it's a heck of a novel. It's a
Oh
Oh,
my.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I think on earned endings too. I think tone matters. I have a horror comedy that's out on submission, and
good.
it's and so yeah, it's the people do get hurt, people do die, but it had to end. I had to earn that ending as well, and if I would have killed the main character or his significant other, then I feel like that would have been like way too much,
Hmm. Hmm.
because their chemistry is too strong, and it would have been too devastating, and for a story with that tone. So I think, yeah, you have to earn your ending, but you also have to watch your tone. You don't want to have like this funny, kind of, gonna have a laugh. As if it's a movie script, you're gonna have a laugh every 5 minutes, and at the end going, "Pooh, man, shit, that took a turn." Yeah,
Well, I'm
weird
thinking about
ending there.
I'm thinking about the last horror comedy that I read, which was Max Booth's Maggots Screaming.
Hmm.
And
Oh.
I
Yeah.
heard it on audio, and the audio narrator is just amazing and great. But I was wondering, how is the main character and his dad, how are they going to get out of this? How are they going to get out of this situation? Spoiler alert, not going to spoil like a lot, but I like the fact that the ending was not what I thought, and it was earned, and it wasn't a case of, oh presto changeo, we've got the magic solution that we can wave a magic wand and you're out of the woods. Isn't that great? I really liked the commitment, and it was at the same time it was sort of a heartwarming ending in an odd way. So yeah, uh, I think with horror comedy, that's a delicate,
Oh yeah.
fragile flower.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's all about tone and how many and I'm not even that good at horror comedy. It's just I had these characters I couldn't get out of my head, and and so I basically have this young couple who are faced with something monstrous, these two are like night and day, and it was so easy to write them because for whatever reason they're madly in love with one another, and it's probably because they're so opposite, and so it was just a lot of fun, and there was no way I could just have like a total downer ending on that. It just would there's I couldn't do it. Plus it would ruin the last line, so yeah, I couldn't do that. I just couldn't do it.
Well, you got to have that last line. I respect the last line because that's the end of the communication that you're having with the reader, and so
Hmm.
absolutely, it sounds really cool. It sounds really awesome.
Well, I hope that we can see it soon.
Well,
We'll
fingers
waiting on
crossed.
news, and that's usually the case.
Yeah, one of my least favorite parts of being a writer is after you sent your baby out into the world, and then you hear just silence for so long. So, congrats. So I wish you the best of luck.
Oh, thank you, thank you.
So,
Yeah.
Michael, is anything in the works for you coming up? And
Oh, there's always things in the works. Yeah, I have quite a strict writing routine, so I'm always creating things. So I mean the novel that I'm working on at the moment, I've referenced in a few podcast conversations. It's called Daddy's Boy. I don't know if you've heard me mention it before, but essentially pitching it as a Joe R. Lansdale heist novel meets The Greasy Strangler, but set in Guy Ritchie's Broken Britain. So
okay,
there's quite a
okay,
lot of
okay.
things going on there. That is definitely the most comedic book that the most comedic novel that I've written thus far. Um, like at the moment, I'm redrafting it because I mean, I have this tendency, and I to really kind of go for some long, almost Tarantino esque conversations, and I feel that perhaps I overdid it, and I made the comedy. I really embraced the Greasy Strangler kind of aesthetic, but I think for some people it might be a bit too absurd. So I'm going through it. I'm paring things down, and I'm just trying to make that story a little bit tighter. But I'm kind of, I guess that there's a kind of crossroads where it's like, do I want to lean into the comedy more,
Mm.
or do I want to make it slightly darker? And and in a bizarre way, the answer is yes to both. So that's kind of what I'm doing at the moment. But I'm just tightening up that story. And a number of beta readers, including Bob, in fact, have read an early version of it. So I've got that feedback. I'm implementing some of that. Then, when I've tightened it up, I'll send it to Ryan, who's my film manager, but also just film manager is kind of underselling what he does. Like he'll look at each story and tell me what he sees as its strong and its weak points, and then when it's got the Ryan treatment, I can look at, right, how do I want to go about publishing this? Do I want to send it to some presses? Do I want to look at going the indie route? What is the vision? So that's one of the projects. I've also wrote a screenplay for my short story, What Would Wesley Do? I've adapted that into a feature length film. So actually, Ryan is looking at that at the moment. But then after I've gone through it as a screenplay, I actually want to adapt that into a novella. So
Oh, cool.
it's a story that started off as a short story. Now I've written the screenplay version, but the screenplay unlocks so many ways that I could expand the story that I now want to write it as a novella or short novel, depending on how it comes out. So yeah, there's that. There's another novel that I'm like 70,000 words into, called Together Forever. It's a psychosexual thriller in a kind of Adrian Lynch, Adrian Lynn, who's Adrian Lynch, some bizarre David Lynch, Adrian Lynn amalgamation. Yeah, that initially started off as quite a commercial idea and then has morphed into something utterly bizarre and weird, which I shouldn't have even been surprised at because that's just how I do things. So yeah, there's those three projects, and then seemingly every week my brain will bring me a new idea, and I just have to decide, like, are we going to work on that soon? Are we going to park it? So there's all sorts. There's also enough short stories that I could potentially put out a collection. So if people enjoy my work and they're excited to see more Michael David Wilson fiction, then don't you worry, I've got us covered for quite a few years yet.
I think you were saying in a recent in the podcast with Joe Sullivan about the issue of like anthologies versus short story collections and the
Mm,
saleability of those, and um, and it seems like it seems like I'm seeing more people put out collections, which is a wonderful way to get that um, sort of potpourri of what an author can do in um, different areas for them to explore. And if you put one out, I think that'd be really wonderful for folks to be able to read and see.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I tend to find that a lot of readers love short story collections, but for whatever reason, they're commercially less viable. Like they
Why?
tend to not sell as well. And
That's so weird because, in many ways, you kind of figure that you're getting, almost like a sampler of what an author can do. I mean, I think that that's how a lot of people got introduced to Stephen King, especially when they were younger, is not just through like the big
mm,
mammoth novels, because those were probably scary, but through
yeah,
I remember, being, oh, I'm going to say in junior high, and people were like, "Have you read that Stephen King story about the guy that eats himself?" And it's like,
yeah.
yeah. So that's funny that they're not as commercially viable.
Yeah, yeah, of course a generalization where there are exceptions, but that seems to be the trend. But for me, I'll put out a short story collection of my work because that's what I want to do. That's what
Right.
I want to see in the world. I mean, there might be a clue to, because I'm writing things like Daddy's Boy, because I'm writing things like House of Bad Memories with chapter 22. I'm not always doing things because I'm thinking, wow, this will be the next commercial success. This is a Koontz or Patterson style book. No, it's not. It's weird. It's awkward. It's quirky. It's a little bit like me, and I want to see it in the world. God damn it! So
I think
that.
honestly the best writers are the ones that are writing from the hope that it'll be commercially viable, because you want, not necessarily because you want your you want to be, wiping your tears with your $100 bill collection, um, but rather because you want people to read your stuff that you love, and you want it to be out there, and you want people to enjoy it. And if that comes with money, fantastic, awesome. Who's going to turn that down? But the best writers I think, are writing because they've got a reason, because the voices in their head talk to them and won't shut up.
Yeah, yeah, and all the things that become commercially viable, that really explode, there was never a formula, there was never a prediction that it would become commercially viable. I mean, if you look at Fight Club and when that came
Mm,
out, it just
mhm.
tapped into something for a lot of people, but nobody would have said to write that book and to write it in that style. Like, so, I mean, some people will say, "Oh, it will never be me," and they're kind of down on themselves. And I kind of feel like, yeah, well, with that attitude, you're probably right. It won't be. But I like to take a more Josh Malerman approach, and it's like, well, why not me? It has to
Right.
be someone. Why not? Could be.
Well, and I think about someone like I think about somebody like John Kennedy Toole, that wrote this bizarre, quirky book of Confederacy of Dunces set in New Orleans, um, and he passed away as a young man. And his mom actually, if I remember the story correctly, bugged the crud out of a publisher and said, "Read my son's book," which went over about as well as you might think. But finally, somebody did, and said, "Oh my God, this is amazing." And so even, you know hopefully we can all, be like Josh Malerman, before before we pass on, and enjoy the fact that people are liking our fiction. But I agree with what you said, that giving up is not. You just don't want to see people give up. You just want to see them continue, because sometimes that's half the game, is just showing up.
Yeah, yeah, and remembering that it is a long game. I think, I've had this discussion with a few writers before, and somebody might release a book, and then in the first few months the sales weren't what they expected them to be or they hoped that they would be, and now that they're really down, or they feel that the book was a failure, and it's like, no, this is such a long game, and no book has an expiration date.
Mhm, mhm,
So I mean, it could become big at any point. And I mean, I know I just mentioned Josh Malaman, but I think, it's quite a good example in the sense that, like, yes, but Bird Box was pretty successful to begin with, but when it got the Netflix deal and when it became a movie on Netflix, like, it
mhm.
jumped to the next level.
Yeah.
So this kind of thing can happen at any time. And I mean that there are kind of better and more extreme examples. I mean, I like to go back to Edgar Allan Poe, who in his lifetime, unfortunately, he was not a success at all. Like, he was not really known. But now, I mean, it's difficult to think of many writers, particularly in horror, that are more famous and more known than Poe. I mean,
Mhm,
the easy, obvious examples. It seems to be Poe. It seems to be Lovecraft, and it seems to be Shirley Jackson.
mhm.
Obviously, for a modern equivalent, it's got to be Stephen King.
Yeah. Well, and it's you read a biography of Poe, or you read pretty much any commentary on him, and you're like, oh God, um, you just wish the guy could come back just for 10 minutes and see what his influence has created. Like, look, keep writing. I know that life stinks for you, and you're hand to mouth, and you're just patching together things, just trying to get through the next rent check. I get it, but here's what's going to happen. It's like that great Doctor Who episode where they bring Van Gogh to the modern day, and he sees the Van Gogh exhibit, and the curator of the exhibit just talking with just reverence, really, about the
Hmm.
impact of his work. And you wish that all those creators, certainly Poe, certainly Lovecraft, Melville. I mean, I could keep going. Would see what they had given birth to.
Yeah, yeah, and a real tragedy is that a lot of not just writers, but artists, musicians, creators of all sorts, they seem to be celebrated perhaps even more so posthumously. It's very frequent that we'll see a celebrity die, particularly if they're like a musician, and then the next few weeks, like their album or their songs, they're at the top of the charts. And I just feel, this signifies the importance of celebrating and supporting and buying the art of creators while they are with us.
Yeah,
And, telling them how much they mean to you. I mean, when we had Chuck Palahniuk on the show the other day, Bob specifically told him how much his work had meant to him. And, that's important. We need to tell writers, because it can be a bit of a lonely place sometimes. And don't assume that a writer knows of their importance or how much they're affecting people, because quite often they don't.
I think that's 100% right. And even if you feel, the way that I would look at it is that even if you feel like you're sucking up, or that or that they've heard this a million times, or that you're, whatever, I'd still rather say it to somebody. Your work made my life better. Your work made the world better that I live in. Um, so that they know that, even if they've heard it a million times, well, okay, fine, I'll be number 1,000,001, because it matters. Everybody who's said, your work touched me. I've been blown away. I'm sure that's the same for both you and Bob as well.
Yeah, yeah, it's a very surreal experience for both, my writing and for the podcast, when people, tell me that it has affected them in some way. And I mean, I often say, with the podcast, it's great when we help people to become better writers or to unlock something within their creativity. But the most gratifying feedback for me is when, yeah, we've spoken about mental health and we've
Hmm.
spoken about depression and suicidal ideation and topics like that, really heavy stuff. And then you have somebody say that they listened to the episode and it just helped them work through something, or it helped them feel less alone. And when I hear that, I think, well, this is why we do it, and this is the stuff that matters. It's like, if I helped you to write a good story, then that's great. But if I helped you find some light in the
Hmm.
darkness, it's that's a kind of magic, really.